Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Fireside Chat. Oh, my goodness, I can't believe it's already been over a week. We're kind of in the midst of spring break, so there's been a bit of a pause in terms of connecting with people. Want to just encourage you, as always, to subscribe, hit the notification bell if you don't want to miss any as they're uploaded, and just say thank you again for those who subscribe and support. I am super, super excited today. I have got Omar Reyes with me, and welcome, Omar. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Trish. It's an honor.
Yeah, I'm just really excited about our conversation. You and I've had, a few off-the-cuff discussions over the last year, and I just felt like, gosh, when we talk about the conversations that we've had around church, I thought these would be some good things to share with our listeners. So before we get started, though, digging into some of that, why don't you, whatever you're comfortable sharing, why don't you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself so they can know who you are?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, I mean, my story is pretty broad. So originally, if I want to go back, born and raised in a little country called Belize, Central America, previously known as British Honduras, a little British colony that sits between Mexico and Guatemala. Came to the U.S. when I was 19. Just by the way, took me 14 years to get my what they call my permanent residence. So came here 19, joined the military. It's another story, but joined the U.S. Marine Corps and did 6 years in the military. And then I moved to Florida. My military 6 years was in North Carolina, and then I moved back to Florida and then to Texas. So that's kind of my journey to Texas. So now I'm currently in Texas. I'm married, my Belizean girlfriend. Been married now for 37 years and 4 wonderful kids, 2 grandkids, and probably 2 on the way. So we've just multiplied here in the U.S. So yeah.
That's exciting. The growing family. That's exciting. You guys are a wonderful family. You're a wonderful family. And I didn't know you were in the service. Thank you for your service to the United States. And that's
you're welcome.
I didn't know that part about you. So Well, let's share with the listeners a little bit about kind of how we know each other. I'll kind of start that, and you can add anything you want.
Sure.
We haven't known each other that long. Maybe it's been 2 years now. I'm not even sure it's been that long. But we met through. It's hard for me to say we met at church or we met, because we don't really, the way our little gathering is doesn't really carry the same connotation that church means for a lot of people, I think. So, and that's some of what we're going to talk about today. But we have a gathering. We call it ecclesia or ecclesia. Different people, I guess, say it different ways. Caribbean, I don't know, tomato. And so we met through that. At the time, there was a different, if you want, we don't even use terminology like senior pastors and things, but we had someone who was basically pastoring, and you came alongside, and you guys were kind of co-teaching. And so you and I began to have just some conversations after our gatherings about a variety of things. And that's how we met, and we've continued to have some off-the-cuff conversations every now and then. So I don't know, from your perspective, anything you want to add to how we met or know each other or our connection?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of, that's right. We did meet at that gathering that met in the coffee house, and there was an immediate connection. I think what you were saying, what God was speaking to you, my journey into Christianity, into the church world through religion. You know, the long journey, pursuing the Lord, and in the midst of that, dealing with the systems around. So I think when we met at the gathering, which was a group of people that were really pursuing the Lord together, kind of an organic church in a coffee house, I think when we spoke to each other, there was a common, kind of a common spirit in what God was saying. And I think that was interesting for me and for you as well. So we just got to talking about our experiences, with religion, church, and so forth. And that began kind of our relationship.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's been really, our conversations have been really meaningful. And I think to kind of springboard into that, because what we really want to talk about today, or like what's on my heart for us to talk about, around even some of the conversations you and I have had, is this idea of church. What is the truth, the reality about what church really is, what it was intended to be? And we've had some discussions about that, and I think it's interesting that the dynamic that we met and experienced each other in was, like you said, it's in a coffee shop. We just had this small organic kind of living room. Everybody participates and gets to dialogue around things. That's why I hesitate to call it church, because in most people's mind, you think institutionalized church when you hear the word church. And then in the midst of that, the whole COVID thing hit, and so it has caused us to even look at it more closely. What is Jesus building, I guess, would be a good question. And you've got some great perspectives on that. So when you think about what is Jesus building when he says, I will build my church, and you look at where we are today, and you've had lots of amazing encounters. So I just want to kind of open the space and let you share some perspectives that you've had throughout the years in your journey, and then we can talk a little bit about what we think COVID, what are the opportunities that it's provided for us to consider.
Sure.
So jump on in there, and whatever your perspectives are that you want to speak to.
Sure. Yeah. So I go back to my childhood. I was raised in my Christian experience, religious experience, was raised by Canadian missionaries. So missionaries from Canada went out to Belize many years ago. So my parents were Roman Catholics, and they were converted to Christianity through these missionaries. I grew up in the system, kind of the missionary system. They taught me about Jesus, and they planted churches, and they built schools, and all my teachers in my formative years were Canadian. So I received Jesus through their teaching, and I think I received Jesus many times. I don't know. I think if I remember my early childhood, I pretty went down to the altar a lot. It's kind of this idea that I needed to re-receive Jesus. I grew up in that, but at age 18, 19, about 18, I began to it didn't make sense anymore for me. It wasn't relevant to my life. I saw many things, a little bit discrepancies here and there, but I kind of got disinterested in the whole teaching and Christianity in general. And so, it's very legalistic. So I didn't know it then, but it was a very legalistic system. They did preach Christ, and I believe the message was pure, but it was really kind of encumbered in a system that I thought was very, very legalistic. It was more works-oriented. At 18, I lost interest. So when I came to the U.S., I was not really following the Lord. I joined the military, was living my own life, and kind of walked away from the idea of Christianity. And I still believed in God, but wasn't living in any way connected to the teachings. But it was one night in a bar one night in Jacksonville, North Carolina, where the Lord really met me. He encountered me at a bar one night, and he really spoke to my heart in the midst of the party and the drunkenness and all the things that go along. You think about military / bar, all that environment. And in the midst of that, he spoke to my heart so clearly. Sitting at the bar, the Lord spoke to my heart. And he said two things to me. He said, I am not that. And matter of fact, he said, I hate what you hate. And in essence, he knew my heart. And, the Lord speaks two words, and it means volumes, right, to us. And really what he said to me was, I'm not religion. You threw me out with religion, and I actually don't like that either. I hate that. Mm-hmm. And so in a moment in time, I experienced what I tell people is pure grace. Like, why would God even go there and pursue me? I was not obeying him. I was not. But why would he chase me down, speak to my heart? That's how humble God is, the humility of God, to pursue what I perceive to be a nobody, and to tell me that he loved me and that he was not about religion. Well, I experienced what I called pure grace. Like, the grace of God was so transformative and so powerful that in an instant, my life changed. I remember walking out that bar after that encounter and never looking back. That's how powerful the message of grace came to my heart that night. And I experienced the love of God. I experienced what he wanted in relationship with me. And then he told me that he was really not that. He was not about religion, and that I had confused him with that. And so that encounter radically changed my life. I came back that night. I gave my life to the Lord. I began to then pursue him to this day. Just walked with him, of course. It's never been so easy, but it's not been an easy walk, but it's been a very focused walk. I never looked back never looked back, and I just kept moving forward. And so from that moment on, I think I was about 24, 25, I moved back to Florida and just began to just, go to church, the things that we know to do. And then my journey began into different denominations. I Southern Baptist, Independent Baptist, Charismatics. So my journey was through these religious experiences, and every stop the Lord taught me more and more about himself in the midst of it. And so when I moved to Texas to work for a missions that was building orphanages in Guatemala. And so I came here in 1999, 2000 to do that. And so my experiences following the Lord has been beautiful through religion, but also very eye-opening, because I stepped right back into religion, and I've been fighting it for all these years to not be, encumbered by it anymore, but to try to see, Lord, where are you? And so my journey into to church and Christianity and what this life is all about has been my journey to this point. And I've had to rethink church, because, of course, that's the big word, right? Like, you become a Christian, you go to church, and so you just adopt what church is, and you begin to live your life as far as how you comprehend it. And so it's been many years of just exploring the nature and the call and just this thing called church.
Yep.
It's super interesting, too, because in a similar vein, the Lord is, as I began following the Lord, again, he came for me 14 years ago. And I love how it's like he encountered you. I loved how you said that, because most people are like, yeah, I encountered the Lord, and they're looking for the next encounter of the Lord. But this place is like he shows up, he encounters us, he makes himself known. But likewise, as I stepped into following him, it was very much going from one ministry or one church environment or one type of church culture to another. And in all of those, it was like he would sift through in each of those things what was him and what wasn't him. Like, here I am and here I'm not. Like, this is me, this isn't me. Because it's a mixture. What I've found is every encounter I've had in a church type environment or whatever it's a bit of a mix, because you got people right in there, and church has become a lot of institutionalized, almost using a business type approach to church. You hate to say it, but we have overlaid a lot of business. And not that there's anything right or wrong, but it definitely can. In some churches, you can feel it more than others. But one of the things you and I talked about several, it's probably been months ago now, is this idea that, at least for me, it feels like part of the problem, especially when people, what you were saying, you become a Christian, you go to church, is church really is an identity. I mean, Jesus is building his church. We are the church. And if we haven't comprehended, like, we church, it's who we are, it's where we go, it's what we do. It's not where we go to be in church. There's a part of our identity that is rooted in church. And so that kind of shifts things a little bit in how we approach our walk with the Lord, or at least it has for me. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. You get saved and you go to church. That's that right off the starting gate, right off the beginning, that is set in your life as a new Christian. And so the journey to me, the journey that deviates from what God intended begins at that point. Because just the fact that now church is not the people, church is something you go to, establishing that at the beginning of my life it's that slight error. It's that little deviation, and that's what the enemy does. The enemy doesn't come with you with bold, in-your-face error. He just slightly deviates you. He takes you off course, and the way he does it is by redefining words. So church became a thing you go to. We close the church. We lock the church. We leave the church. We go to church. All that begins to then form in your mind a way of thinking about church that sets in place. And really what it does, it prepares you to serve the institution. It sets you so you don't question it anymore for years. And if you don't really step back, and sometimes through hardship or different difficulties, to reimagine it, step back and go, really, what is church really? I mean, as simple as that might sound, it's a big question, because it's foundational to how we live our lives and how we live out our spiritual life within the context of church and Christianity. So you're absolutely right. And for me, I just took it, that formed my early thinking, and I just began to live it. Now, within that, of course, there's many good things that God does, but ultimately it does frame your mind and how you live it out. And I found it to be always restricting, and sometimes does it really work that well? And so, like you said, every experience you learn, God teaches you, this is me and this is not me. And so you begin to then look back and rethink these things. Yeah.
And there's a lot of him to be found in the midst of, the institutionalized, what we would call or think when we think the word church and how it's been defined. There's also a lot that, but he's perfect. At least he has been with me to sift through those things and show me where the distinctions and the differences are. I remember, this would have been probably back in 2010, I remember I had a dream one night. I think I may have shared this with you before, I don't remember, but I had a dream one night, and in this dream, I'm in the parking lot of this, just like a big, huge, I guess it would be, you'd call it a mega church. It's a huge parking lot of this big, huge church. And they're doing all this construction on the parking lot, because the parking lot's gotten worn out, and there's potholes and there's cracks. So they have to, they're doing work on the parking lot. Like, the parking lot has to be repaired because it's getting so much use. And I just heard the Lord say, as I was waking up, I wish my people would get out of the parking lot. And it's the first time where I really went, oh, okay, so let's talk. I need you to talk to me about what you mean by that. And I began this discovery with him, this journey of understanding what his heart for people and his church and gatherings and relationship and what it really is. And what the church is intended, like you said, it can be a place where people then begin to serve this institutionalized system when the church should be equipping people to go out into the world and be the church and use their gifts. And so it was an interesting experience. And I know you've had many conversations. I know you and your wife even have had just, if you want to call it revelation from the Lord on gatherings. And you have one story in particular I'd love for you to share about when you were with, I guess, a group of church planters, and they were discussing their goals for the next year. And do you know which one I'm talking about, the story you've shared?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing that? Because I think especially for our Western civilization church mindset, it's riveting.
Yeah. No, it says, I mean, and for me, just traveling I had the opportunity to travel and still do in many different parts of the world to visit churches and people and groups and just a lot of ministry as it relates to the global church, and to learn from them. I mean, a lot of my learning has come from listening to them about this issue of church and what it means. I mean, for me, when I think about it, Tricia, I think to really go back, as simple as it is to go back and go, in Matthew where Jesus mentions church for the first time, and actually he talks about church twice. He mentions the word church twice. He does. I mean, of course, Paul talks about it, but Jesus himself, he says, I will build my church. And so the question is, what church are you building and what does it look like? Well, he says the church that I build will be at the gates of hell, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So when I read that verse in Matthew 16, number one, Jesus says, I will build my church, but the one that I build will be at the gates. Well, the gates, they don't move and set up shop somewhere. Gates are still, they're places of fixed places, and that means God's church is mobile. It moves towards that, and its intention is to move in those areas. That's difficult. And so traveling the world and seeing the church operate in different environments. For example, the church in Lebanon, let's say how they operate when you can't have buildings and you're under persecution. How does a church function? And so I got to really understand in my mind, like I got to the point to go, if the church has to be resilient, if the church cannot withstand persecution, and we cannot survive, but not only survive, thrive in difficult environments, it's really not the church that Jesus builds, because his church not only survives, but thrives in the most severe of difficult situations. And so I remember one of the pastors I met, he was an apostolic leader up in Africa, one of the countries in Africa, had a movement of about 250,000 people. And he had built it over the years. God had built this movement, and in his movement, he had 250,000. I remember him looking at me over dinner one night, and he said, we're talking about church, and he says, the church that you build, he goes, the church that you build or that Jesus builds is able to, he said, to withstand two things. If it can't, then he said, it's not what the Lord is building. And he said, number one, it has to be able to handle harvest. Can you add 3,000 and can you disciple 3,000? Meaning, if God wanted to add to the church, which he did in the early church, he added 6,000, he added 3,000. He said, so whatever you build has to be able to assimilate and handle harvest. That's one. He said, but the second thing, it also has to handle hostility. It has to be able to thrive in hostility. And I thought, man, the church in the West, those two, we have difficulty with both of those. And so I began to learn some things and what God was doing and what the Lord was doing as far as building a church as resilient and is able to move and be mobile, but also thrive in the midst of it. And so they saw church differently. I remember the other conversation, the story you're referring to was I was sitting another time with a group of them, and we'd meet once a year. I would facilitate these discussions. I was a facilitator, and these were all apostolic leaders that had, big movements around the world, very humble men from all over the world. I think there was only one pastor from America there, and many others were from different parts of the world. And they were talking about their dream for churches, like how many churches would you like to start? Of course, that's the language you use, but they understood the Lord built this church, but they were talking about how many churches would you like to plant? And so the numbers went from 20 to 30 to 50. And we went around to this one gentleman that was from a very, very difficult country under severe persecution. He looked and he said, my goal is to plant 6,000. And I thought, okay, we're not even in the same planet. Like, the numbers don't make sense. And so we have max 20 to 30, and he has 6,000. And I realized he was viewing church and defining it completely different from most people. And so it got me thinking. Of course, I dug in a little bit more to find out what was he thinking about, because we're not talking the same language here. Right. And so it was just how he saw it was totally different. And I think he was seeing it more from the way Jesus would see it, So.
Yeah, and we've had conversations about that, and it's kind of, I always think about, in fact, I was thinking earlier today, knowing we were going to do this call, I was thinking about, in Acts, when 3,000 were added and 5,000 were added to the church that day. Right. It's not like they had programs and here's your starter kit and come to beginner's class. And like they had right. to have a like that's what we do, right? Oh, we're adding people. Let's get you, we've got these classes that will meet so many times a week for the month so you learn, what all this is about. And they had none of that, and yet the Lord added, and they then had to get them discipled. And so this, I think this whole notion of what is church? What did they do with those 3,000 new people, those 5,000 new people? They didn't have bricks and mortar. They didn't have, they didn't have programs. They didn't have children's church and all that, small groups and all that stuff. So how did they absorb that? And it sounds like this other gentleman had a clearer view of what is considered and what is defined as a church in the same way that Jesus would have defined it. So do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I think it's kind of where you've had some conversations about that, even with you and I have, and even among our small group, what that really looks like.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, that's a lot to unpack if you think about what he meant. But I just essence really, when I spoke to that gentleman, I asked him, tell me more about, what do you mean by 6,000? And his statement was every believer a church planter, every home a church. So he looked at churches where small groups gather, and we know this is common language, but they actually live it out. So where, believers gather, Christ is the head of his church, we gather as his body, and we trust that he leads us. Of course, there's natural leadership that rises from it, but I mean, he was seeing it more from church as simple as this might sound, that church is people, and Jesus was building people. And so he was living that out in a very practical way. Now, we say that here in the West. I mean, you go to any church conference, you hear this exact same language, but we mean different things. We say every person is small groups, and we're called the people of the church, and we will use the same language. But then what has happened to us in the West is that we have built a system around that truth, and the system is the institution, where we have decided that we can do that within an institutional model, which is a business model, which there's nothing wrong with it. But then we here are now encumbered now with buildings and seats and trying to take all this movement and put them together in a building so that then we can extract money and to do good things for God. And so it's a whole system that just drives it, while they don't have that. Yeah. They just focus on the relationship, focus on the people, the homes of the church. Every believer is a church planner, and I think that's how they, in actuality, live out the message versus, we say it, but we have a different system around it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know a lot of the language that you and Alicia, your wife, use. Of course, we talk about the twos and threes. This notion of where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst. It's the church, right? Yeah. That's he's there. But this Correct. Notion of really rooted in hospitality
the importance of that, and how all of that, that's how we add to the church, to be able to handle the harvest and even handle hostility, if you will, this notion of twos and threes, deeply rooted in relationship, hospitality, and just the small gatherings, and trusting that Jesus is the head of that gathering, and people move in their natural gifts just in life and in those small gatherings. So I know that you guys have talked about kind of some if you call it a vision or whatever, that the Lord kind of spoke to you about hospitality and gatherings.
Sure.
And this was, I don't know, how long ago was that? It seems like it was a few years back.
Yeah, it was many years ago. I mean, he just gave us a prophetic word about 20-some years ago, but, that unfolds, the word of God. Mm-hmm. He gives it to you, and then it just begins to then unfold it over the years, because the words seem simple, but it's very, very, very powerful as to what he's speaking to us about church. And really, the prophetic word had some essence that it said things like, one of the statements that came out, this is what a prophetic word I've kept for all these years. It says, and you will break, and literally he said, and you will break the spirit of the institutional church in your home. And you will teach believers how to relate to one another and how to relate to God. And so it was that principle of relationship. I remember some years ago, I was in Belize, because I do some work there once in a while. I go back, and I was driving down one of the villages in the country, and it was really dusk. It was a Wednesday night, really kind of getting dark, and I was driving through this village. I had to slow down over this little bump they have on the road, and I looked across to my right shoulder, and there was this neat little building. Maybe it's about a building of 20 by 30. It's a little concrete building with a steeple and a cross. And I peeked inside, and there was like Wednesday night service, I guess. And I slowed down, and I kind of glanced over, and in the building that Wednesday night was about 8 people. There was benches on both sides, and there was about 8 people sitting in the front. And there was this high kind of podium where the pastor was preaching to 8 people. He had a shirt and a tie, and of course Belize was 120 degrees, so he has a shirt and tie because that's what they taught him. And then he was preaching to them, looking down to 8 people who were sitting in the front bench of prayer meeting night, which was a Wednesday night. And that's what we teach. We transport these systems when we go overseas. We take our systems with us, and then the people adopt these things, and it becomes their way of doing church. Mm-hmm. And I glanced at that little service, and the Lord spoke to my heart. He says, I never intended that.
Yeah.
He said, that was never my intention. He said, if you take those 8 people with that guy, and you put him in a home, and you share a meal together, and you pray for one another, and you talk about the word together in a home, and you have relationship, he says, that's where I intended that to be, not in that system.
Yeah.
And it just kind of dawned on me that if I took the exact same 8, 9 people in that building and put them in a home around a table, and we shared a meal together, and we took communion together, and we broke bread together, and we prayed for one another, how different that environment is.
Yeah. Well, and because relationships are being built, you know each other's lives, you know each other, and you can practically apply the word, not just understanding the word from a doctrinal or theological perspective, but you can actually practically have conversations about, well, where does the word speak to that? How would you practically apply this to your, whatever a person's struggle is, like finances or relationship, or what would the word say about that, and what are some practical things that you can apply from the word to that situation to transform it? And you can do that together in relationship with one another, where you're just not going to get the depth of that instruction, if you will, or that even caring and concern for people's lives in the big institutionalized church. It just, you just
see it happen at that level. And so
exactly,
yeah.
And that's exactly what it is. I mean, if you look at Acts 4, when it says when the early church did these things that we teach often, one of the elements of the early church gathering was, and they had fellowship, right? So they broke bread, they prayed, they had fellowship. That word fellowship there, it's not a potluck dinner. Fellowship means koinonia. It was intimacy of life. They shared an intimate life. There was an intimacy in their sharing. And I think that's the lacking in when we have just communication as far as preaching to you without the life. There's no richness of the word dwelling among us. Paul says, let the word of Christ dwell richly among you. That's a relationship with each other, but also relating to the word, which is Christ among us, which then produces a different kind of life.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because the truth is we can sit in church our whole lives and our lives are never transformed because there's not that type of depth and vulnerability in relationship with believers as a body, with Christ as the head, that's building everyone up into the full stature of Jesus, right? That's the whole goal, and growing in your gifts and learning how to utilize your gifts among the brothers and sisters in Christ, just that equipping. Well, I want to honor our time. I don't want to necessarily end the discussion short. I want to pay attention to the time. But anything you want to add to that, please feel free. And the other question I'd love for us to have a couple minutes to discuss is, what do you think? What are the opportunities COVID has presented for the church?
Great question. Yeah. Let me just kind of look at, because this is going to be we can talk hours on this, right? But let me,
I know.
as far as the fellowship and all the, here's a principle of life that's rooted even in biology, and it is rooted in creation. Intimacy begets life.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is. I mean, even in relationship, it's intimacy that produces children. It's intimacy that produces life. There's a multiplication in intimacy of life. So that principle also relates to the church. There's only multiplication of life with intimacy with each other and with the Lord. And so when you don't have that, I mean, I've been 30 years in the church, and what I've seen with the system, it produces some good things, but the enormous amount of time and effort and the return of investment, for lack of a better term, what it produces is very little. Because I see believers that spend decades sitting in those pews, but they're never transformed. There's never a transforming experience. They get a lot of knowledge, but knowledge itself doesn't produce life. Knowledge is just something that's static. It's just information. What produces life is a relationship with the Word and with each other that produces it. So I've been, for my life, I'm kind of through so many years of church, and again, never want to be disparaging about it or talking, but the reality is that I've not seen it really be effective in producing what God meant. So I've devoted my life in my current next season is really going back to what I call just the basic of church, which is in Matthew, where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am among you. And I think this idea of 2s and 3s that's mentioned there's a powerful dynamic in that verse that I'm exploring to say, Lord, what do you mean by that? And how can we live it out in such a way that that's very, very potent and powerful? Because in 2s and 3s, there could be intimacy. It's mobile. It's very doable, very multipliable. It could be duplicated often. You can have many people released in their gifts. There's so many things that can be done in these numbers of 2s and 3s gathering. Now, I'm not against the big gathering. I'm just saying life is lived out in the small. So life is experienced in the small. The big are great. If you're going to go to be inspired and you want to go to a big building and have 10,000 people and be inspired, but it's been proven that never produces transformation. That just gives you information at the very best. But if you take that into relationship, then life there's transformation and intimacy, and all these things that the Lord, even for example, James 5:16, if you confess your faults one to another, you'll be healed. So there's healing even in the confession of our faults one to another. Well, you can only do that and be safe in that within smaller groups. So for me, like, I am deeply exploring the small, like, thank God I've got the big. I've lived 30-some years in the big context of church. Let me give my life to exploring what you meant by this and how do we live it out so that church can be experienced anywhere and everywhere? And how can we be impactful to our society? Because I think there's a genius of God within that verse that I think is yet to be explored. We use that verse, again, in the church, but again, it's also within the system of the institution. So ultimately, always kind of has to feed back to the thing at hand, which is, the systems at hand. Quick story, like in Lebanon, I heard a story in Lebanon. A friend of mine who does work in Lebanon says that there is kind of a government church. There is the church, what they call the legal church, but said the underground, where he says this 2s and 3 movement was taken by a taxi driver, and they began to then gather believers in 2s and 3s with the word and prayer. They didn't need curriculum. They don't need all the stuff, hauling down all the stuff with them. They just simply use the word and the Holy Spirit and relationship. And they began a movement there. And over like 2 or 3 years, they just kept multiplying and sharing the word, and 2s and 3s in coffee shops, 2s and 3s in restaurants, 2s and 3s in homes. And they have it all over it was that underground movement they were working with. And he said a couple of years ago, the leader or some of the leaders says, hey, let's gather a big meeting. Like, we don't know who belongs to this group. So we just know that God's with us and he's multiplying believers and they're coming to know Christ and they're gathering in 2s and 3s all over the city, but we don't know who they are. Let's create a gathering. So they sent out like a message, a communication piece to go, hey, if you are belonging to this network, you have friends, we'll gather in this warehouse in such a date and time. And he says over 8,000 showed up.
Wow.
So the Lord was doing his work underneath everything, busy, just simply with the word and the Holy Spirit, believers gathering together, sharing life, praying for one another, and the Lord was multiplying that movement. And I thought, now if that can happen in 2s and 3s, I think that's the potency of the church in its very small form. And to segue into COVID, I think COVID has made us aware that the small is the way to withstand hostility. It's the way to multiply. It's the way to grow in the midst of difficult situation. And that's because there's no persecution yet. We handled COVID. COVID was not so much a persecution of the church. COVID was, the Lord sent us back to a room to rethink our lives and to rethink things. So, I mean, he basically told us, go to your room, everyone, and think about you and what you're doing, because the current situation in America, the church finds itself in a place where it's lost its voice. It has no influence anymore. It has no testimony. And I'm just talking the big C. When you look at, for example, commentaries and you see politics, you see the church divided, you see the church being political, they're fighting over this, fighting over that. There's no kingdom message that transcends the current culture. We're mixed up in the culture. We're joining groups. We're taking sides. And what you see is a weakened state of the church. But I think in the midst of that, the Lord is saying that is what I'm dealing with. But if you look at exactly the work that I'm doing, is I'm wanting you to learn how to live in relationship with one another. And I think what it's doing is driving us back to the small. I think overall, if you read all the stuff they're writing out there, every denomination, every church, every movement is talking about the power and the necessity of the small. And so I think the Lord is just kind of he is challenging us to think through our paradigm.
Yeah. It's really good too, because it's it's a removal, if you will, of the things he never intended. Like you said at the beginning, that's not what he intended. So yes, COVID's been probably unpleasant, but I would venture to say that the true church, like those that honestly pursue him, seek after his kingdom. Like, I don't know that I believe that there are many that probably haven't really skipped a beat much in all of it.
Sure.
But it's drawn people into these smaller clusters, if you will, and the smaller gatherings, and which is more of what he intended. And it makes me wonder, in light of the times that we're in terms of human history and the things that we know scripturally, if this isn't also a preparation for harvest. Like, that old paradigm has to go if we're going to be, like, we have to rethink it for the very reason of harvest and hostility. If that's where we're headed in the coming days, the Lord wants the church, his church that he builds, to be able to handle that harvest.
Exactly.
His way of doing it is not the model we've been operating under, for decades. And so it's an opportunity. I think COVID's brought us an opportunity to really look at what church is and where it shows up in our identity versus just something we go do. Like, really rooting in us that we're the church he's building as people, as individuals, and the collective us as part of our identity are the church. And so,
well, I mean, think about it. Just kind of an example. It's like during COVID and during the kind of the sentiments of the church, or the cry of the church. Well, a large portion of it, and most of it, was that the government was using the virus to exert control and power over the church, right? Like, they were using it to close the church down, to tell us when to worship, and so there's this kind of like fight back from the church to keep their buildings open. And I'm saying, you cannot close the church of God.
Right.
The very fact that you're fighting a government entity that you think are trying to close the church down tells you something is wrong with the way you're thinking, because no one can close the church of God down.
Right.
You can't close the people down. It's like when we remove prayer from schools. I mean, yes, I would like prayers to be in school. I mean, I'm a believer, and I think it's a good thing for kids to pray, but you cannot leave prayer out of the schools. Prayer is not something that you dictate. It's not a mandate by law. Prayer is something we speak to God, and no one can stop me.
Right.
So what you see is the systems of the church. Every time you see them fight back, flesh to flesh or system to system, you realize, okay, what are we afraid of? Because if we're the church, we can gather in homes. Me and Elise, my wife, can gather and pray. That's 2. I have my children. That's 3, 4, 5. I can have a group of 8 in my home, and that's my family, and we can have church. We are the church, and so you can't. But they can close down your 501c3. I mean, they can close down your buildings. But the Lord is saying, but that's not me. I'm not there in that thing. I'm with you, with my people. So you see that even in our language, doing what we were fighting back, you can see that our paradigm of church is really wrong.
Yeah. It's so amazing because we grow up in the mindset, right? I remember years ago, like well over a decade ago, the Lord said something to me about, you're going to have a ministry. I'm like, well, okay. So what do? I jump in and start for weeks, researching 501c3s and what does it take to do that. Like, I think ministry equals 501c3, like in my head, because that's, I grew up in the world. Like, that's what I know. And, like, he's so gracious. I'm frustrated, and about a weekend, he just kind of interrupts and goes, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm researching 501c3s. You said I don't have a ministry. And he goes, it has nothing to do with that. Like, so, again, he's a genius at kind of separating out those elements that just because we grew up in Western American Christianity, whatever, what we think things are, he's great at saying, yeah, that's not, I didn't make that. People made that up. That's man-made, a man-made thing. And so, and to your point, God, you can't close the Church of God. We are, it's people. And can't know this. I mean, so, well,
Yep.
any last-minute thoughts or any encouragement or challenges that you would give to the listeners to kind of, in this place that we find ourselves in today, with COVID, with the political things going on, anything that you would want to say to the listeners to encourage or challenge them in this particular season that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. You know, I'm on my own personal journey of discovery, and I get excited about when a paradigm changes, a whole new world opens up to you. You know, it's like it's a whole new world of creating, innovating, creativity, and so because I'm stepping out of the church paradigm, I would call it. That's where I grew up most of my life, which is buildings and going to and service. The church is a service, is a series of thing we do on Sunday. All the stuff we do in there, and I've moved away from going, okay, Lord, and the Lord's changed my paradigm really. So the world, there's new ways of thinking. Every time a paradigm shifts, it opens up the world of creativity and innovation. And I think believers don't get discouraged. I think if we just change the way we view things, I think there's a new world waiting for us when it comes to the Lord, knowing the Lord differently, gathering differently, experiencing church differently. Because I think it's life-giving when I think about that and the future and just me exploring it. This gives me a lot of life. So when the world goes, the church is not working or the church is this, I step back and go, okay, Lord, your church is powerful. You're in charge. You've never lost control. So I want to line up with that. You know, I want to live according to how you see it. And so I would encourage believers to not waste what God is doing. Like, listen to his voice, make the changes. If your heart's exploring new things, do it. He's in it. He's creative. And for me, instead of getting discouraged, I was, last year, I kind of got off the off-ramp, if you call it the off-ramp of these kind of big institutional churches or just church in general, the way I was thinking about church. I just got off the ramp and just said, okay, Lord, I'm here. Where do I go? What do I do with my life? I felt like the Lord was just inviting me into a new way to explore, a new thing to do. But I went to him really sad one day, and I said, Lord, I'm disillusioned. I'm very disillusioned. I was at a retreat about a year ago, right after COVID, and I was going through a lot of transitions. One is the church transition. And I told the Lord, I'm very disillusioned, Lord. I was looking for a little bit of pity, right? I mean, I'm going to the Lord to cry, and I'm using words like disillusion. And I felt the Holy Spirit tell me, good. He said, I want you disillusioned. I want you severely disillusioned. I thought to myself, wait a second, I wasn't expecting that answer. I wanted him to he said, think about the word itself. I thought, the word means to be illusioned, to live under an illusion. He goes, yes, until you figure out that you're under a delusion, until you figure out that what you see, what you call religion and church is an illusion, you'll be open to the truth.
That's powerful.
And so I am disillusioning you so that you're open to truth.
Yeah.
And that was an invitation for me to go, okay, God, here I go. I want to know you differently. I want to know you. I want to know you in a different way, and I'm pursuing that. And I would say to believers, take the opportunity to think different, to know God differently. And that's the invitation he has for us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and because truth is where power and freedom, true power and true freedom reside. It's the bottom line. So if we feel like we're experiencing power in the illusion, we might need to question that power because
true.
you know what I mean? It's really it's so powerful for him to point to that and say, you need to see where what you've believed is truth, right? It's really just an illusion because I've got true power, I've got true freedom for you, and that's only in truth. And if it's an illusion, it's not truth. So, so powerful. Well, Omar, oh my goodness, I thank you. I've just, as always, I mean, that's one of the things over the last year and a half or so that I've just enjoyed our conversations, because who knows where they're going to go, but it's the heart of the Lord for his church, and really the heart for knowing the Lord better and what his plan is, and where we have been disillusioned because we want to come into alignment with his plan, but just really seeking hard after him. And I appreciate that about you and our whole gathering. The hearts that pursue the Lord are so precious to me there. So thank you for taking the time to chat, and I'm glad the listeners have gotten just a glimpse into you and your heart and some of our conversations around church. And I hope it gives people something to ponder and think about a little bit, like you said, to think differently. So I just want to thank you.
You're welcome, Tricia. There's so much here, but, it's exciting times to live in as God is showing us new things. So it's really good to talk to you, and hopefully somebody gets something.
Oh, I'm sure they will. And I think it's important for, the listeners, as you said, to understand is, hey, we're on the journey, right? So who knows a month from now or 2 months from now what more we will have learned or unpacked or uncovered, and where we ourselves will be transformed as we continue to bring our own thinking and our mindsets about things into closer alignment with the reality of his intention for his church and what he's building. So everything he does is transformative, and we have to unlearn. We have to be willing to unlearn everything we thought we knew to learn the truth of his thoughts and his ways and how the kingdom works and how it operates and how the principles there operate, not the world. Like, we know the world. Like, it's the only place I've lived, so I know it really well. So if things are aligning with what I feel comfortable about and I know because it seems to match the world, you kind of have to question it, because the kingdom doesn't work that way. And our home for eternity will be the kingdom, and it's an opportunity to learn how it works.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
So we'll know how to, we can thrive in that environment and not this environment.
Amen to that.
So, well, I appreciate it again. I know the listeners will get something out of it, and who knows if we'll have an opportunity to do this again, but I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me tonight, and I look forward to getting this one uploaded and posted for listeners to appreciate and get some insights. So,
thank you, Tricia. Thank you for your invitation. God bless you.
Yep. All right, listeners, thanks again for joining us. I'm always delighted to have you pull up a chair and listen in to the conversation. Feel free to hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, or leave a comment. Let us know what you got out of this. We love the feedback. And I just look forward to you joining us the next time around on the next Fireside Chat. See you then. Bye for now.